Okay, we can take you some seats. I think we'll have to try to start on time. It's nice to see so many of my students. Thank you for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gaydosh. I'm a professor in the Department of History. I also want to make mention that I was told one of the members of our University Board of Trustees is here, Barry Dozer. And a special welcome to all the people from beyond our university community. Welcome to Westchester University in our commemoration of HaShoah. The term Shoah is really the more appropriate term to use for what we call the Holocaust. And the celebration of HaShoah is a remembrance day for the victims of the Holocaust. It also marks the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising from April 19, 1943. Normally, you would hear and see my friend and colleague, Dr. Jonathan Friedman, here. He is the director of our Holocaust Genocide Graduate Program. He would have introduced me tonight. It was probably well over a year ago that I told him I would like to offer a presentation on Father Bernhard Lichtenberg. And he said, well, why not do it for HaShoah? And so I'm here. He is not. Last week, his father died. And he asked me to offer this memorial for his father. These are Jonathan's words. Saul S. Friedman, one of the architects of Holocaust and genocide studies in the United States, died on Sunday, March 31st, 2013, after battling Parkinson's disease for nearly 20 years. Born on March 8, 1937 in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, Saul was the 8th of 10 children born to Albert and Rebecca Landau Friedman. For many years during his childhood, Saul lived in poverty with his brothers and sisters in a housing project in Maria. But he, like his siblings, was determined to leave an imprint, to mold a better future for himself, his family, and his community. In 1955, he graduated from Maria High School, and he went on to graduate as valedictorian from Kent State University in 1959. In 1964, he married Nancy Evans, a fellow social worker with whom he worked in the welfare department in Columbus. In 1969, he received his PhD in history from Ohio State University. And that year, he began what would become a 40-year tenure as a professor in the history department at Youngstown State University. In those 40 years, he served the university and community with distinction. He was an enormously popular teacher and a prodigious scholar. He cared deeply about his students and their success, and he wrote with a level of depth, humor, and sophistication that few in our profession can match. His effectiveness as an educator was matched, if not exceeded, by his contribution to scholarship. He produced 12 books, an astonishing feat for any scholar. In the late 1980s, he turned to documentary filmmaking. In 5 of these productions, including one on French Holocaust survivor Robert Clary, won regional Emmy Awards. He was a tireless advocate on behalf of the Jewish community as well, and a leader of the Zionist Organization of America. He served as a trustee for the William Schermer Charitable Foundation and was instrumental in the dedication of a Holocaust memorial at the Youngstown Jewish Community Center. Over his extraordinary career, he received 6 distinguished professorships and the Ohio Humanities Council's Richard Borgeson Lifetime Achievement Award for service to the humanities. The culmination of his work came in 2000, when he received an endowment from the Clayman family of Youngstown to establish a Jewish Studies program at Youngstown State University. My father was an extraordinary man. Countless generations will be able to study his groundbreaking research on the Holocaust begun at a time in the 1970s when there were only a handful of other scholars in the field. There are now legions of former students who are educators who will make sure that history is taught. He wanted to leave an impact, and he did. Jonathan C. Friedman, Director, Holocaust, Genocide Studies. So we remember Jonathan, Dr. Friedman's father today, and so he's not with us. Our Yom HaShoah commemoration this evening offers you an opportunity to view some of the museum projects that our undergrads have done, and I think there's one graduate student project there. You also have the opportunity to hear me talk about Father Bernhard Lichtenberg, about whom not many people know a whole lot. And at the end of my presentation, we will have a presentation of the Torah scroll by our graduate students to the university. For those of you who plan to watch the Louisville, Michigan game tonight, there is no rush. Tip-off is not until 9:23, so you still have plenty of time to get home. I'm not going to be up here that long. A simple question asked by many when studying the Holocaust is, why did so many people stand by while the Jews of Europe were murdered? My response is that there were resistance efforts, there were rescues, there were acts of heroism. Sometimes it just came down to logistics. What could a nation do? What could a community do? A city, a single person. We know that many Gentiles did help the Jews of Europe. Yad Vashem in Israel has acknowledged these people as righteous Gentiles. And today there are almost 25,000 people listed as righteous among the nations. Gentiles risked their lives to save Jews. And the manner in which they did this varies. One of these righteous Gentiles is Father Bernhard Lichtenberg. He was so named in 2004. From a young age, I had developed an interest in the martyrs. From my friend and former colleague, Dr. Claude Foster, I learned about the martyrs, Paul Schneider and Maximilian Kolbe. It was Dr. Foster that suggested I write my dissertation about Father Lichtenberg. Schneider, Kolbe, Lichtenberg were men of strong faith and were all martyred by the Nazis. How many of you have ever heard of Father Bernhard Lichtenberg? From me in class? Okay. He's not as well known as Father Kolbe or Dietrich Bonhoeffer. If you've heard about Father Lichtenberg, you've probably heard and then you know that he, quote, prayed for the Jews. That has become his legacy. Here I read from 3 monographs of well-known scholars that include a small paragraph about Father Lichtenberg. From Günter Levy. There was, however, at least one Catholic churchman in Germany for whom the Christian duty to love one's neighbor amounted to more than a pious formula. The 66-year-old Provost Lichtenberg of Berlin, who right through the stepped-up anti-Semitic agitation continued to say the daily prayer for the Jews. From Beth Reed Hillel. There were obviously Catholic intellectuals, such as Pastor Bernhard Lichtenberg and Father Alfred Delp, who recognized the evil inherent in Nazism. Very few Catholic leaders recognized the danger of political anti-Semitism, although extraordinary individuals such as Father Bernhard Lichtenberg argued that the physical destruction of the Jews would follow from the political rhetoric. And from Victoria Barnett. For the most part, the churches were silent. In Germany, the courage of the few clergy who protested openly on behalf of the victims, such as Catholic priest Bernhard Lichtenberg and Protestant pastor Paul Schneider, is in painful contrast to the failure of their church superiors to support them publicly. So we see the life of Father Lichtenberg quickly wrapped up in a single paragraph in monographs. But I wanted to know more about this man. What made him different from other Catholic clergy or Christian clergy? Why was he willing to risk his life to continue to pray for the Jews for 3 years? Did he have a special path toward this martyrdom? Sounds a little bit like the Zondervan thesis, doesn't it? I believe that there was a sort of path for Father Lichtenberg. There were things that differentiated him from other clergymen and some turning points in his life. And I know 5 specific things that really played a big part in his life. Number 1, his family raised him with a very strong, openly practiced faith from his childhood. He continued that practice of his faith openly for his entire life, up until his last breath. Number 2, growing up, Lichtenberg, he grew up in the eastern part of Germany, known as Silesia at the time. Today it's part of Poland. And in that part of Germany, Catholics were a minority. So I believe that he had an experience of understanding what it was like to be a minority. Number 3, the bishop assigned Lichtenberg to Berlin. And when you're in Berlin, that's where everything's happening. He would have never been in the situations that he was in had he not been assigned to Berlin. Number 4, Lichtenberg entered politics on a local level. There weren't many priests on the councils, but there were some. And so he had the opportunity to learn how to deal with secular society, the language to use. He got more confidence, I think, in himself in dealing with people outside of religious faith. And number 5, Lichtenberg traveled abroad. He went to a number of the Eucharistic congresses. One of them was in America. He came to America in 1925. He traveled to Niagara Falls. He traveled to Washington, D.C. Got to see a lot about America. He also, in 1936, traveled to Palestine and was on his own, walking all over Palestine. So I think he had the opportunity to see a lot and become more of what I would call a cosmopolitan Christian. And he really seemed to stay away from German nationalism, that strong nationalism of the 1930s and 40s. So I begin here with his family faith. When Lichtenberg was first arrested in 1941, he began a journal while he was in prison waiting for his trial. And this is the very first paragraph of his journal. He writes in third person using a pseudonym. He called himself Fridolin. And you can see from his early entries that he thought so highly of his family. And this one phrase you see, Deus meus, arte duluce vigilo. O God, my God, to thee do I watch at break of day. He repeated this over and over and over in his journal. It's at least twice on every page of his journal. So this is really a focal point of his life. We see his parents here, August and Amelia. They remained very close to their son Bernhard. They moved to Berlin in later life, and after August died, Amelia lived with her son. She was even there when the Gestapo came to take him away for questioning. So they were very close. It was the family that Lichtenberg remembered when he was in prison. So he began this journal. In his diary, Lichtenberg recalled many aspects of his family, how he went to Mass with his mother every day. He had planned on becoming a priest from the time he was a little boy. His grandfather led prayer for the extended family. He was there all the time. They would sing carols, and so prayer remained the center of Lichtenberg's life. Here in this, you see an image of Winterdam Linden, the main boulevard that goes from the Brandenburg Gate through Berlin. And people would often see him walking through the streets in his cassock, very conservative, with his head down, praying his breviary, which is the Catholic prayer book that they take with them all the time. During the time Lichtenberg was growing up, this is his hometown of Olau, which is today's Oława in Poland. There were twice as many Protestants as Catholics in Olau. And it was during the time of the Kulturkampf. Lichtenberg was born in 1875. Germany had become a unified nation in 1871, and immediately the Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, had begun his battle against the Catholic Church. It was a battle for culture. Who was going to be able to control this 1/3 of the population of Catholics? Would he or would the Pope? Because the Pope had come out with statements of infallibility. So immediately Bismarck started putting in place with the Reichstag a number of laws that went against priests. One of these laws was called the pulpit paragraph. Ministers speak from the pulpit. And the pulpit paragraph said you may not speak against state laws in any manner from the pulpit. And so this law never came off the books right into the Nazi era. And when Lichtenberg began praying for the Jews, ultimately that was one of the counts against him when he was arrested, because it was against the law to pray for the Jews. So this law went all the way back to the Kulturkampf. So the Kulturkampf had an effect on Lichtenberg's hometown as well, because in his hometown, his Catholics were a minority. His father owned a business, a grocery store with a deli. He also had a wine bar in this store. And the town officials had told the people, you may not shop in that store because he is Catholic. So you can imagine this young Lichtenberg, he's just a small boy because the Kulturkampf goes on until 1887, 1888. So when he's a young boy, he sees this, he experiences this, he probably knows the problems that his father goes through. So I would suppose that he came to understand a little bit what it was like for his family to be under this situation as a minority. His father's store was able to continue because many of the people out in the suburbs came in because they needed a place to exchange goods and such. So the Kulturkampf lasted for almost 2 decades, and it affected this life. Lichtenberg would have understood that, but then also when he went to the university, he would have been almost the next generation. So some of his older classmates or professors, they would have experienced the Kulturkampf. And so he came to learn a lot more about it when he went to the university and the seminary. Lichtenberg was, and this is an image I put up here, it's in the script of German in the top, but you see on one side are the Germans, on the other side is the Catholic Church. Kind of like a chess match where, they're trying to figure out how to each side to get what it wants. So finally, after 2 decades, Otto von Bismarck realized this was not going to work. So I suggest that it gave Lichtenberg a sense of being other, in the same way that maybe Jews had felt as others. Also, when Lichtenberg goes to Berlin, he is going to be ordained in 1899. He will be assigned to a parish in Silesia for 1 year, but then in 1900 he will be assigned to a parish in Berlin, and he will stay there the rest of his life in Berlin at many different parishes. The population in Berlin in 1905, 87% Protestant, 11% Catholic, 83% Protestant, 11% Catholic, and 5 or 6% Jewish. So the Catholics were quite a minority in Berlin as well. And that's why the bishop was sending many priests to Berlin to try to develop Catholicism there. Lichtenberg raised money, built churches, and we start to see a growth of Catholicism in Berlin. Maintaining the rest of his life in Berlin put him in what I would call the lion's den of Nazism. Nazism really begins out of Munich, but eventually they go to the capital city, and it's hard to do anything in Berlin without being seen, without being heard. So when Lichtenberg begins to write against the Nazis or speak against the Nazis, he's definitely in the lion's den. This is an image of St. Hedwig's Cathedral, where he will become either what we call the provost or the Domprost. It really ultimately is the second position of the church in Berlin, second only to the bishop. For those students of the Holocaust, it's in the square in front of St. Hedwig's that we see the book burning in 1933. This is right near the university. So Lichtenberg, again, is really in the middle of things once he goes to the cathedral in 1932. Okay, stepping back to 1919, Lichtenberg became involved with local politics. Following Germany's loss in World War I, the Allies forced on Germany a new form of government, a republic. And this gave the opportunity to the Catholic Church to say, okay, we've got a new form of government, we need to get our hand in there. We need to be able to make sure we can have Catholic life, Catholic schools. And so one of Lichtenberg's former parishioners said to him, why don't you become a member of the Charlottenburg local council? Because at that time he was the pastor at the Charlottenburg Catholic Church. So he did, and he became also a member of the Berlin City Council. And he put himself on committees where he could speak about the welfare of children and about the education of children, making sure that, he tried to make sure that they could have Catholic education. So this gave him the opportunity to really be out in what we would call a secular society. On May 7th, 1920, in one of the Charlottenburg council sessions, Lichtenberg declared that positions in Berlin that dealt with youth care and welfare should include the priest's office. Religion was still very inherent in people's lives, and he believed that priests needed to be involved in that. But he went on in that meeting to say, and I assume also the office of rabbi and Protestant pastor. He didn't have to do that, but not only did he say the priest should be involved with youth welfare, education of Catholic youth, but that the rabbi should be involved with his youth, the Protestant pastor should be involved in his youth. This was something that I think is different from what other priests may have said, that he actually took that time to say that. This is an image of what the City Hall chamber would have looked like. Lichtenberg, after this time in the 1920s, began to write letters of protest when things arose. There was a problem with the former High Command Ludendorff and his wife, who seemed to be anti-religious in some way, and they were trying to talk to the people in Lichtenberg's parish area. He went there and pretty much stopped what they were doing, but he went beyond that, and he wrote a letter to President von Hindenburg in the 1920s. So this was a man that did not hesitate to write to the highest levels of people to say, we've got a problem here. And I can imagine that he wrote to the president as a way of saying, hey, remember Ludendorff, your sidekick in World War I? We ought to know what he's doing now. He always seemed to choose to write to the person he thought could make a change. So it gives us a sense of where he's going all the way already in the 1920s. Another aspect of Lichtenberg is that he traveled quite a bit. And so I have an image here of North America, Israel, and England, because he was in all of these places, which varied, but had a lot of opportunity for learning there. So this strong nationalism that developed from World War I, everything we've seen, Lichtenberg never supported World War I. He would talk to the widows, and he never said anything, but he never really supported it. He joined the German peace organization, so he was for peace. But he did travel a lot. And so I suggest, again, I have to tell my students to think about communism as an international practice, movement. Christianity is international as well. And so I always see Bernhard Lichtenberg as being more of an international, cosmopolitan Christian and not a strong German nationalist. So he never bought into the strong German nationalism. Here are two things he wrote in his prison journal about his times in these countries. And you can tell from the way he writes that he's very observant. Everything seems to have great meaning to him. And he takes all that, and he doesn't forget it. He went to America in 1925. He's writing this in 1942, and it still seems to be very clear to him. He went to Palestine in 1936. He was really impressed by a Muslim deep in prayer, because to him, prayer was so important. While he was in Palestine, he had the help of many Jews to help him get from place to place. He just seemed to be very open to people in general. Here are a number of pictures of Father Lichtenberg. I've got arrows pointing to him. In the classroom with his female students. It's said that some of the students called him the Pope because he just seemed to be so overwhelming about the way he taught in his faith. Here he is next to the bishop. So he's got a pretty high level in Germany. That's probably why the Germans did not arrest him so quickly. Here again, standing behind the bishop. Again, you can see his very conservative dress. He never gave that up. In the 1920s and 30s, there were priests throughout Europe that were beginning to dress more, each step of the times. He never gave up his conservative dress. So, from what I've told you so far, I maintain that these 5 aspects of Lichtenberg's life prepared him to protest the Nazi regime. His strong faith in Christianity that pushed him to speak out for the persecuted, the understanding of perhaps being other, a front row seat in Berlin where Nazi action could be seen daily. The experience of politics taught him that he could make a difference with his words and his actions, and that from traveling abroad, his Christianity seemed to trump nationalism. I want to show you a 3-minute clip from the Holocaust miniseries. This miniseries was presented in 1978, 7.5 hours. Interestingly, the characters that are true characters are the bad guys, and the fictional characters are the Jews. But there was also one true character in this miniseries. They never showed the Pope, they never showed bishops, but they showed a scene of Father Lichtenberg in 1938 following Kristallnacht. They also mention him a few other times where they mention that he has died, but they do show him following Kristallnacht. They've actually taken this 3-minute scene and combined 3 years of his life into one. So I'm going to show that 3-minute clip now.
Let us pray in silence for the children of Abraham. Outside, the synagogue is burning, and that, like this church, is a house of God. In many homes, an inflammatory newspaper is being distributed, warning us that if we show any sentimentality toward the Jews, we commit treason. This church and this priest will pray for the Jews. For all victims, we shall pray. For all those facing terrible ordeals. For all the innocent. Let's go. Gaydosh, security police.
I listened to your sermon with much interest.
What did you learn from it, my son?
That you are a kind man, but misinformed.
I know what is happening to the Jews.
Father Pope has concluded a concordat with Hitler. The Vatican regards us as the last bastion between Christian Europe and Bolshevik.
But that does not justify tormenting the innocent.
No one is being tormented.
But I've seen Jews beaten on the streets, sent off to prisons for no reason.
They are enemies of the Reich, and we are engaged in a war, Father.
A war against armed enemies or against defenseless Jews.
Father, I appeal to you to be more temperate in your remarks.
I will follow my conscience.
that lead you astray. You must be aware that almost to a man, church leaders are actively supporting our policies.
Well, in that case, I must draw a distinction between what Christianity teaches and how some people distort and betray that teaching. Such an intelligent young man. Our gift to the new era.
Okay, so we see Father Lichtenberg in this mini-series. As I said, they wrapped up 3 years into this 1 3-minute segment. But he knew, he had seen living in Berlin on November 9th, 1938, what had happened. And so beginning on November 10th, in his evening prayer, he began praying for the Jews. And so you would have people walk out of the service because there were times when Nazi officials would be in there watching to see who was coming to this service. Interestingly, they did not arrest him immediately. He would continue to pray for 3 years, every night at evening prayer. His prayer included not just the Jews, often he talked about the non-Aryans, the Jews, the people in the concentration camps, and this was not well received by the Nazis. So they didn't stop him, but then, as they mentioned in the video, he said something about a paper being sent out to people. That happened in the middle of October of 1941. Lichtenberg found a flyer on his desk on which was printed a Jewish star, and above it the title, "Wenn du diese Zeichen siehst," when you see this sign. What followed was the usual hate campaign against the Jews. It read, "When you have read this text, then you know, German men and you, German women, resolve to do something. Recognize your enemy." So at that time, Lichtenberg decided immediately to take some action. He decided to write something that he would speak at the next Mass that he celebrated the next Sunday. He showed a draft of what he was going to say to his chaplains, and they said, "Oh, Father Lichtenberg, you shouldn't say that." I mean, his people close to him always worried about him. He's already in his 60s by now. He's been in hospital often. He has a heart condition, and he just keeps calling down the wrath of the Nazis on him. So they said, "Oh, please, Father Lichtenberg, don't say that." But he didn't listen to him. He prepared to say this, but he never got to preach this. He never got to say it. What he had planned to say was what he had written. "In Berlin houses, an anonymous hate flyer against the Jews is being distributed. It maintains that every German who supports the Jews from false sentimentality practices the betrayal of his people. Let you, through these unchristian convictions, not be deterred, but rather hold on to the firm precepts of Jesus Christ. You should love your neighbor as yourself." And this is what Lichtenberg said even when he was questioned by the Gestapo after his arrest. "You should love your neighbors as yourself, and I consider the Jews my neighbors." The beginning of the deportation of the Berlin Jews began on October 18, 1941. Lichtenberg was arrested 5 days later. So it's very easy to see that the Nazis waited for a particular time to arrest him. It seemed that in 1941, in the fall, everything was changing. There have been reports that Catholic priests from Germany were in the same bunkers in Dachau with non-German priests. They began to separate them. There was a big change in the fall of 1941. So Lichtenberg was put on trial. He was in prison while he awaited his trial. He was found guilty on 2 counts, the Nazi malice law and the pulpit paragraph, because he had prayed for the Jews. He was condemned to a 2-year prison sentence. He was already serving it, so he fulfilled serving those 2 years. During that time, he often had to go to the infirmary because he was ill. His friends and family had hoped that he would be able to be released after 2 years, but the Nazis knew that he would not be quiet, and so they refused to release him. A kind of interesting thing, when he was sent to the prison, he had the final prison that he was in, Tegel prison. he had to fill out a prisoner questionnaire. And one of the questions was, do you have any strong passions, such as drinking, smoking, or sex? And Lichtenberg wrote down, I labor daily against inordinate ambition, avarice, and pleasure. You know, I struggle to be good. That is my passion. But they also asked him, what would you do, or what will you do when you are released? And he responded, I intend to fulfill the will of God and remain true to my priesthood until my last breath. And so the Gestapo knew that they would not release him after the 2 years. And so when his release date came up, his brother was there to pick him up, no Bernhard. They took him to a temporary camp somewhere. He was really beaten horribly. And then he was put on a transport to Dachau. During this transport, they stopped in the city of Hof. And they took all of these people in the transport and put them in the local prison. And interestingly, the other people that were with him realized how sick he was. And they allowed him to have the only bench in the prison to lie on. And then he began to hallucinate. And he was praying, and then they started laughing at him. But one of the jailers came and saw how sick he was, and they realized that they had a paper that said, if this particular inmate gets sick so badly that he needs to go to the hospital, take him to the hospital. My guess there is perhaps they worked out some agreement with the bishop, because he was very close to the bishop. He was number 2, right below the bishop. So they took him to the hospital, and he died the next day. We have the testimonies of the doctors and nurses that were there that said, in his last hours, he just kept saying, oh, you good people, oh, you good people. The doctors were surprised that the men wanted to take him back to the prison, thinking, are you crazy? This man's dying, you can't take him back to the prison. So he was en route to Dachau, but he died before he got there. He has been beatified by the Catholic Church in 1996, and Yad Vashem named him righteous among the Gentiles in 2004. So he was one person, one story, but someone who did have a concern for the Jews, did what he could. In 1936, I think, the bishop had named him the head of the Hilfswerk that helped non-Aryans in Berlin. He helped with letters of introduction, with affidavits to try to get out of the country, and so he did help in many ways. Here is, once he died, some of the priests from Berlin came to Hof, picked up his body, and you see him lying on his deathbed. When you get a really close picture, you can see that his fingernails are purplish color, which comes with a heart condition. But you see him with that long beard, which you would never see before. And he was always clean shaven. And then today in St. Hedwig's Cathedral, where he had been